Hello, everybody. Welcome. So good to see everybody again. I forget how to do these things in the break between spring term and fall term, but I think we managed it pretty well here. My name is Courtney Shaw. In case you're not familiar with me, I'm the facilitator of the series. So I am here to introduce people. I'm not actually going to be the one sharing their knowledge today, but I'm the one if you have questions afterwards about like how to get to videos or what's coming up next. That's a me question. If it's a question about the material itself, that is a speaker question. So let's find out who our speaker is today. Julia Mitchell earned her AA degree here at LCC before transferring to Northwest University, where she completed a BA in Strategic Communication. She's been here at LCC since October of 2020. In fact, is it today your 2-year anniversary?
Is.
Congratulations. She works in the lovely Learning Commons department as the tutoring center coordinator, which means she hires, trains, and supervises some of the coolest student workers on campus. So please, everybody, let's welcome Julia Mitchell.
Okay, Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. It is truly an honor and a privilege to get to kick off what I'm sure will be an excellent series on the wonders of the world. I know a lot of the speakers we have coming up are truly talented, knowledgeable, wonderful thinkers that have excellent topics to share with you all today. And I'm excited to get to share with you on what I truly believe is a deep human wonder. It's both science and art, it's nature and nurture. We're going to be talking on the topic of resilience. What it is, what happens if we lack it, how much we are strengthened by having more of it, and how we can work to cultivate resilience in ourselves and in those around us that we care about. With that, just to kind of have a frame of reference, what are we talking about? What do we mean when we say resilience? It can be used in many categories. We see this often in the social sciences, also in the physical sciences. But today, what we mean is the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties. We can think about this in terms of elasticity, the ability to spring back into shape. So to contextualize this a little bit, we can look at this in the form of trauma. We experience lots of challenges in everyday life. So this could be from surviving a pandemic or a car accident, the loss of a loved one, grief, etc. How quickly can you experience those hardships that we have every day in life and bounce back? This isn't to say that we're no longer impacted or we no longer need to grieve or heal, but to return to somewhat of a baseline is essentially what we're referring to here today. What I love about resilience is so often we talk about it in kind of the frame of, they get back up, they have that stick-to-itivity, they have that strength. That seems really conceptual. I think of Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, was really popular over the last few years. But really, resilience is quite tangible. It's chemical, it's in our bodies. And the biology behind resilience really takes place in 3 places within our brain: the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. These 3 areas are the largest kind of determiners of our decision making, our emotional processing, and of course, our hormone control as they're connected to the limbic system. So these are the decision-making and regulation centers, and research currently from the University of Chicago indicates that resilient people have higher connectivity between these areas. What we mean by connectivity is interactivity between all of these areas of the brain. So if you're to kind of envision like an MRI scan, or like the usage of brain areas, folks with higher resilience have more connectivity between these 3 parts. So how does that translate? What does it matter if 3 parts of the brain are working together? How does that make us more resilient? The simplest way to break it down is just that more of the brain is responding to stress, which is increasing our level of resilience. You can kind of think about like, if you're trying to carry a couch by yourself, that's a really heavy load. But if you're trying to carry a couch with multiple people, that might be a little bit easier. So in this analogy, your friends are parts of the brain, I guess. Okay, so it's a long-standing argument between lots of scientists on whether or not humans are more comprised of their nature, the genetic material that we inherit that's passed down through the ages, or nurture. What does your environment determine for you? What do the circumstances you encounter in childhood make you into? Things like that. Well, as with most things, I think, it is both nature and nurture that determines your resilience level. The first is your genetic inheritance. This is coming from the American Psychological Association, that currently 33 to 53% of your, we'll call it resilience quotient, is passed down. Interestingly, and we don't have time to get into the super depths of this, but I highly encourage you to read more into it, it is more maternal. This is currently being attributed to the birthing parents. Their resiliency or their response to stress during pregnancy can impact the fetus and their baseline resiliency. So it's super interesting in how genetics is just a fascinating topic in and of itself. But we can kind of take this to mean that you might be, just from birth, starting from a bit of a lower baseline or a bit of a higher baseline. This is not the end all be all to how resilient you can be or how much you can develop or how you will respond to every circumstance you encounter in life, but we can just kind of consider it our starting point, so to speak. The next factor is your environment in adolescence. So it's totally possible to strengthen your resiliency quotient at any point in your life, but it is certainly established its baseline in your childhood. So based off what your parent or your caregiver or those in your closest circle model to you in your adolescence, and when we're referring to adolescence, I really mean like birth to 12 years old, before you're in that more like formative prepubescent teenage stage. So based off what you see. So just to follow an example, if you are, let's say, 7 years old and your parents experience a major financial hardship like the collapse of an economy, you are either going to develop a higher level of resilience or perhaps a lower level of resilience based off how they respond to that hardship. If your parents turn inward, don't discuss it with you, display a lot of stress about this, but don't take any active steps to try to address the situation, that is going to model that behavior and therefore a lower resiliency to encountering those kinds of problems later in life. Alternatively, if your parents tried to model something like, well, this sucks, but what are we going to do about it? You're going to see that model and you might have a wider knowledge base and a wider resilience to those kinds of issues later in life. Kind of make sense? Great. The next one is ongoing development. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about at the end, is how can we develop resilience? The brain is more adaptable early in life, which is why this is so important that we model to the younger folks in our life. But it doesn't look like we have any 12-year-olds in here today. So for the purpose of this conversation, we want to be talking about what we can do as the grown-ups. What do we want to model to the children that we know, but what can we do to help ourselves at this point? It is never too late to strengthen your brain. It's never too late to work to connect the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus to get that interactivity to help build your resilience level, to have more parts of the brain carrying the couch, so to speak. And to kind of help crystallize this in our minds, I think everyone should have a rubber band in front of them. Is that true? Okay, let's play with it. Just take 10 seconds, see how far you can pull it. Careful not to snap your fingers. Maybe make a very scary rubber band gun. Okay. Who has like a large rubber band, one of the bigger ones? Okay, looks like Instructor Tower, Natalie Ton. Quite a few. Okay, can someone with a big one hold it up and like show us? Okay, Natalie and Chris in the back, look at how far that can stretch. Very nice. And when you let it go, does it return kind of back to its normal size? Very nice. Okay, who has one of the itty bitty ones? Oh, very cute, Lindsay. Anybody else? Pretty small? Okay, can you hold it up where everyone can see it? Nice, thank you so much. So obviously, medium size. Why doesn't everybody hold up theirs now and we can just kind of get a scan around the room? Some of these, they're pulling like almost a foot. Some of that's pulling like 3 inches. The analogy might fall apart if you push it too far, but in general, we can think about resilience like that elasticity, that ability to bounce back. Some folks, based off genetics and their family environment growing up, and how often they work to develop their resilience in everyday life, they might be able to stretch really far. They might be able to encounter really tough life situations and make the most of it when possible. and some of us, due largely to no fault of our own, maybe we didn't get the highest amount of genetic inheritance. Maybe we didn't have the safest, most resilient modeling caregivers in our early life, and we can only stretch just a little bit before it feels like things are too impossible to overcome. But this is just kind of a way to visualize what we're working with. Feel free to keep the rubber band or not. But the next thing I want to chat with you about are causes of low resilience. So one thing we've discussed already is that family environment, but there are many other contributing factors that I think are kind of more tangible or more relevant for those of us that are already in adulthood. There you go. The first would be adverse childhood experiences and overprotection. So we've talked about adverse childhood experiences a little bit, but specifically what I think is really interesting coming out of Harvard research right now is overprotection kind of being an issue. What I mean by that is sometimes we can think about maybe a helicopter parent, so to speak, someone that cautions or cushions their child from ever experiencing the consequences of their actions, or just feeling the impacts of everyday life. There's always an excuse, there's always a safety net, there's always a fill in the blank, so that those children or those young adults never really feel what it feels like to struggle, to fail, to have to overcome. It actually does not set you up for success later in life, because eventually your safety net's not going to be there anymore. And you're going to have to respond to the crises that we experience in everyday life, major moments from small daily challenges, and you won't have any practice. You won't have anything in your toolbox to help you be more successful with those moments. So interesting to me that it's not just those more traumatic or really harrowing family experiences, but also just overprotection might be a disadvantage. Additionally, lack of social support. I think this is really huge. I'd like to say pretty well emerged from the pandemic at this point. At least it feels like it on campus, which is so wonderful. But I know a lot of communities or individuals have expressed a lack of community, a lack of social support, a lack of close friends and family ties. And that is a huge contributor to lacking resilience in your everyday life. Whether you're an introvert like me or a super extrovert, whether you like it or not, we need people. The human race is a super social species, and we need to be in community to be at the healthiest version of ourselves. I sometimes use the phrase, I'm deeply in love with the human race and I hate people, because sometimes we can just suck. Sometimes people are unnecessarily mean, or they're not trying their best, or fill in the blank. Whatever pet peeve you have about your elbow partner, it's reasonable and we understand it. You don't have to make them your best friend, but I highly encourage folks to try to find social communities or individuals that you trust and can share with, because social support is one of the largest contributors from adolescence all the way through the late stages of life to feeling equipped and like we can handle challenges that we may encounter. Low self-esteem. So I'm sure that this pops up on many lists for why do I not feel so good about the situation that I'm encountering, but specifically with low self-esteem, some of the research behind this for like, why does that give me low resilience? If you have a lack of self-worth, you're gonna kind of expect failure. You're not going to think that you deserve to succeed, or the bad things in life always happen to you, so there's nothing to be done about them anyway. And this isn't to say that a lot of the really negative, painful things that we encounter are fair or valid. At no point in this conversation do I want to minimize trauma or minimize the things that happen to us that really suck, that are just out of our control. This is not intended to be a like pick yourself up by your bootstraps conversation at all. It's intended to help equip ourselves with more tools to roll with the punches and try to work with the horrible things that life gives us. And one of the best ways that we can do this is by working to build our self-esteem. And this can look very different for a lot of people. I know some people really thrive on external affirmation, or practicing mindfulness and meditation and internal affirmation, skill building, lots of different varieties. For me personally, I can't do it. I can't stare in the mirror and do affirmations, I'm strong, I'm beautiful, I'm kind. It just feels cheesy to me. If it works for you, awesome. But one thing I do say in the mirror every morning, and I actually have a sticky note, and this was given to me by a colleague and a great friend, and it's the quotation, In every day, in every way, I keep getting better and better. And that is so helpful for me because it's not insurmountable. It's not something that feels like I'll never reach it or it's unbelievable, it's unachievable. Getting better every day is just moving an inch, moving a centimeter, if that's all you have to give. And it's just trying a little bit harder, learning something a little bit newer, experiencing a new challenge and trying your best to overcome. So whether it's every day in every way you work to get a little bit better or whatever your building of self-esteem may be, we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. That is one of the hugest causes of low resilience is low self-esteem. Next, deficient emotional regulatory skills. So as we talked about, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala especially are emotional regulators. So if they're not firing on all cylinders, so to speak, you're going to have a very hard time emotionally regulating yourself. And because you are having poor emotional regulation, we're not seeing that activity in those areas as strong, which is why we're having low resilience there. That train of thought kind of makes sense, so to speak. So our goal is to help activate more of those areas, create that interactivity that we might see on like an MRI scan, and help to build those up. Finally, for the sake of this chat, we're going to be talking about unrealistic goal setting. This is huge to me. I don't know if anyone's the I'm going to run a marathon next year person and you don't run it all until it's like marathon day and then you realize that was never going to happen. That is me. So we like to say, you know, shoot for the moon and land among the stars. Sometimes we are shooting for the moon and then we are like drowning in space. So this is not to say don't have big dreams. This is not to say don't set big goals, but it is to say try to be realistic with yourself. Do the whole SMART acronym. Is this something I can achieve? Is this really attainable? What steps do I need to take to get to it? Things like that. And if you set a lofty, beautiful goal that you're going to run a marathon next year, maybe try to pre-process how will I feel and what will I do if that doesn't happen. We don't need to not set the cool goals, but we do need to be either realistic with ourselves or just prepared for it not going the way that we want it to. Make sense? Nice. So, risks of low resilience, besides all of those things sounding somewhat unfortunate already, let's talk about some of the bigger picture risks. If we are starting from a lower genetic and adolescent baseline for our resiliency levels, what risks might that disproportionately put us at? First, consistently elevated stress levels, which can result in concerning behavioral changes. So those consistent stress levels, we're really talking about elevated cortisol in our body. Lots of experiences can come along with that, trouble sleeping, poor eating habits, etc. But what I mean by concerning behavioral changes is often when we're in a elevated, consistent state of high stress, it can push people to do things out of their norm. First example we might think of is substance use that is uncharacteristic of that individual. Alcoholism is a huge problem in our county specifically. So when folks have high elevated stress levels, we might see issues with alcoholism or some other kind of drug consumption. Additionally, we could think of things of just like general recklessness. Maybe there's too many shopping sprees. Maybe we're driving too fast consistently. Things like that, where when we just don't know how to cope with what life is throwing at us, we have this persistent low resiliency, we might exhibit behaviors that are concerning to those around us that care about us. One addendum that I really want to make here is that this is not universal. Behavioral changes are always individualistic. What might be, or cultural as well. What might be weird or uncommon for one individual or one person of a cultural background to exhibit might not be odd for others. Heavy drinking culture is common for a lot of individuals, but maybe it wouldn't be for your uncle that has been on a sobriety journey for the last 20 years. Things like that. So keep in mind, or maybe ask your friends, what would be odd for me? Like, what do you see in me when I have those elevated stress levels? And take note of that. But also, as you're keeping an eye on your family and friends, keep in mind that the things that are concerning to you, okay, but is it a concern for them and their general baseline? Kind of make sense? Awesome. Additionally, negative emotional responses to regular challenges. What I mean by regular challenges are just the things. For me, it's the printer. The printer, or all of the lights were red on the way to school today. Things like that, where they're annoying, but they're relatively frequent, and we should be relatively okay about handling them, rolling with the flow, not being greatly impacted. One of the biggest concerns that we see of individuals with like consistently low resilience, hasn't had it established in their life, is that negative emotional responses are way elevated to the daily stuff. The printer is being difficult, which you'll see on the handouts later today, and we want to kick it. The traffic really sucks, so we're screaming and we're cursing, things like that. So, and then the final one are health risks. This is coming out of the University of Chicago as well as the APA. We're seeing literal data that is showing that longitudinally over time, when we're looking at folks, especially we're looking more at senior citizens, so 70 plus range, we're seeing a lot of great health risks across folks on a lifespan of not developing resilience. We're seeing weaker immune systems, just a lesser ability to fight off colds and whatnot, high blood pressure, and increased risk for mental health conditions. I believe that the percentage for that was like 44 to 46-ish% on folks that did not develop high resilience levels in adolescence, then struggled in their early to mid 20s. That is typically when a lot of mental health diagnoses first come about, is the 20s. And we're seeing much higher percentages of anxiety, depression, PTSD, things like that. So these are pretty significant health concerns, like physical, tangible responses to the world that we live in and our physical bodies when we are lacking resilience. So now that we've moved through miles and miles of doom and gloom, let's look at the benefits of having resilience in our lives. First, more effective decision making. This is the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex working in tandem to help you be more successful. I really appreciate when the leaders in the room have a thoughtful, controlled response to situations that we're dealing with, instead of everyone operating in panic mode. I don't know about you, but some of the worst decision-making meetings or just situations that I've been in involve the whole everyone's running around like the chicken with their head cut off feeling. Nobody knows what to do. Having higher level of resilience in our bodies, that greater connectivity, can seriously help rational, controlled decision-making rather than feeling like we're in the panic mode. Does that mean that we're always going to know what to do every time, no matter what life throws at us? Absolutely not. Some things are dreadful and unexpected, and you just have to sit in the silence and suffer for a little while. But in general, we're seeing among folks with higher resilience levels from inheritance, adolescence, and late stage development that the decision making tends to be more thoughtful and proactive. Additionally, better ability to cope with hardships. So, sensing aside the horrible traumas that have no excuse, there was no reason that they should happen to us and no reason that we should feel good about them, because some things just suck and we don't need to turn a bright side on it. However, with resilience, people tend to view challenges as things we can overcome rather than things to be beaten back by. And yes, I was really proud of that alliteration. We're speaking in generalizations today, obviously, because the human body is not an exact science, in my opinion, when it comes to this kind of topic, because everyone is so individualistic. We've already seen that from genetic inheritance, but especially in adolescence, even children from the same family can have wildly different personalities, wildly different perceptions of shared life events. So resilience levels and things like that are just going to be so unique. But when we're talking in averages here, we're just seeing that better ability to cope. That encountering the daily stresses or the major life events and just handling them a little bit better. And how we could define better could, of course, be specified according to what the event is. But just seeing a stronger level of going, okay, I'm going to take this, and what can I do next? Maybe I walked too far away. Our last one is overall greater elasticity to bounce back from life challenges. So kind of similar to the last one, but this is kind of what we can visualize with the rubber band. how do you take it and not just deal with it in the moment, but how do you return to your baseline? So sometimes we have traumatic events like the loss of a loved one or a major health diagnosis, where bouncing back to the very original baseline might not be possible. Things can irrevocably change us in life. But in general, how do we get back to how we typically move and breathe and see the world? So, at the very least, in all of this, by strengthening our resiliency levels, we're helping to mitigate stress-related health concerns. So I say at the very least, but if we go back to the last slide, what were we discussing? We're looking at negative emotional responses to daily struggles. We're looking at weaker immune system, blood pressure issues, higher proclivity to a mental disorder diagnoses. Those are pretty significant health concerns. So at the very least, we can help mitigate that. We can help ward off some of that or just protect our ability to cope with those things should they happen. So the next thing I'd like to do is just a little bit more interactivity, a little bit more conversation. So I know it might feel vulnerable and a little scary, but I highly encourage and would appreciate your participation. So what we're going to do is just fist to 5. Fist is, I really don't feel like I have any resilience at all. For whatever reason, from I'm going to blame my parents and my genetics, or I'm going to attribute it to my childhood situation, whatever it may be, I feel like I have no resilience, to nothing phases me. I can survive the apocalypse. I'm good to go. Obviously, those are kind of the far ends of the spectrum, but from fist to 5, what are we feeling? Okay, we really like the number 4. Would anyone with a 4 or 5 be willing to share just the basics? You don't have to get too personal, but the basics of why you feel like you have that level of resilience in your life.
Well, my name is John. I would say that as a child, I was very sheltered. My parents did not make it a point to allow me to experience hardship, and they protected me from it. And as a result, as an adult, I suffered my own hardships and had no ability to cope. And so I also made it an effort to develop that skill. I would say I've had a very interesting life, a very out of character for most people experiences, and a lot of them were negative. And I think that developed my muscle of my ability to deal with hardship. It strengthened my resilience, so to speak. I've suffered death of loved ones, the loss of personal relationships, um, just, all over the spectrum, basically. And as a result, I would say, hopefully, I have a much stronger resilience to deal with my daily life or when I encounter those situations moving forward.
Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate that, John. So this could be an example of what we were talking about earlier, that not just traumatic childhood experiences, but it sounds like I'm hearing some of that overprotection. That was a negative thing that then John had to pick up and work a little bit harder to develop later in life. How about, yes, thank you so much, David.
All right, so mine's kind of opposite for John. I feel like my resilience comes from my parents' underprotections. I had never really considered it until you had mentioned the overprotection of parents. So my parents were basically non-existent. I was a free-range child. My parents had been divorced, and me and my brothers just had free reign. So hardships came around. We dealt with them on our own. And after watching this, I feel like a lot of this probably comes from underprotection because I really didn't feel like I had anyone looking out for me when I was a kid. We and my brothers kind of looked out for ourselves, and I think that helped me build resilience myself.
Forced learning, kind of not given an opportunity. Thank you. Shelley.
I grew up, excuse me, and had some negative things happen in my life, but I kept running across people who were, and I'm 58, so I've had conversations with like Vietnam vets or people who lost somebody in a war or something like that. And I kept coming across people who had resilience, who did press on after a trauma or a tragedy. Very early in my life, I kept picking up on these people and they were telling their stories or they were sitting at my mom's table or something. And I was like, so then when I ran into that, I didn't get it from my parents, but when I ran into that, I was like, wait a minute, so and so and so and so were resilient. And I didn't call it that, but I like, I saw that they bounced back. So I thought, there has to be some way to get beyond this.
Hmm.
And so somehow internally, I just decided that no matter what comes, there's always something better on the other side of it.
So mindset perspective. Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, in the back.
Oh dear. Well, I find these very interesting because, as you probably know, one of these nice stretchy things,
Rubber
when they
bands.
get as old as I am, they get brittle or they lose their elasticity.
Hmm.
And I think we need to pay attention to our seniors who have had their resilience get brittle
Hmm.
and lose its resiliency, because I think that allows us to maybe not see them as we think they should be, but as they are.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate it. For the sake of time, we'll probably move on, but something I wanted to speak on that specifically is one of the references that will be listed here is talking about resilience and wisdom. And it was specifically looking at what wisdom can we take from our senior citizens, the folks that have lived life, had to either experience what a lack of resilience or the development of resilience feels like. So you're right on there, and I highly encourage deeper reading on that research study. I found it fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's really helpful for us to hear from the other folks in the room and see that, like in John and David's case, they're both identifying that they feel like they have a pretty high level of resilience for exactly polar opposite reasons. So I know sometimes it can be hard to wrap our mind around, like, well, what helps and what doesn't, and what's good and what's bad. That's the art side of resilience. That's the art side of what we like to consider a science. We can try our best, we can do these strategies, but knowing that because we're all individualistic and all of the environments that we're in are going to be so specific to us, if it works for you, great. So with that, how can we intentionally cultivate it? This is generally my favorite part of this topic or this kind of conversation, because we go through the doom and the gloom, we go through the benefits, and it's like, I too want to be a more resilient person. Now what? And that's kind of what we're at. So we're going to do a little bit of discussion here, and then it will be open for Q&A. First, a list. Build connections and prioritize relationships. As we discussed earlier, if one of the biggest causes of low resilience is a lack of social support, one of the biggest things that we need to do is build our connections. So again, if you're like me and you love the human race, but sometimes you hate people, you're going to have to suck it up. You're going to have to find one friend, one social community, and lean into what works for you. Is this your colleagues? Is this your family? Are these your church communities? Is this your tribal community? Is this the macrame hobbyist club at the recreation center? I'm not sure. But whatever it is that gives you life, that makes you feel seen and supported, anyone that you feel that you could call and talk to, those are the people I want us to bring to front of mind right now. Those are the folks, those are the relationships that we need to be investing in. And I know for a lot of us that when we feel like we're experiencing the worst moment in our lives or the biggest struggles or just the daily stress that is too much, we really turn internal. At least I do. I shouldn't speak for the room. I want to go home early. I want to crawl into my bed with my cat, and I want to go to sleep. But sometimes what is best for us is the opposite of what we really want to do. And connectivity, staying busy, being with friends or those that we trust and love can be huge for us. Additionally, develop realistic goals and move toward them. So as we chatted about earlier, instead of shooting for the moon and getting lost in space, maybe try just shooting for getting the laundry done. Speaking for myself here, sometimes it's those daily things that can be really hard to just continue to accomplish. So how can we develop realistic goals, or just be realistic with ourselves about maybe we're not going to hit that goal? What should we do to work towards it? And yes, that element of move towards them. So to continue the idea of, if you're going to run a marathon next year, you should try to walk a mile today. And you should try to get to 5 miles by next month, and probably 10 the month after that. You're taking active, progressive steps toward actually achieving the end goal. And I know that this might sound like common sense, but if you are currently an instructor or a staff member or student here at LCC, which in general, I think that's most of us, we know that sometimes we have these goals. I'm going to get the A on the final, or I'm going to do really well in my community conversation. And if we don't take active little steps toward them, we might not reach that. So how can we continue to not just see the goal as the one thing that we're getting to, but how can we make mini goals along the way that make the big picture more attainable? Accept that change, click that too soon, that change is a part of life. Mourn and move on. And I kind of indicated this earlier, but sometimes we encounter things in life that really do just change who we are. And there's no returning to the old version of ourselves. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We change as people, things happen to us in and outside of our control. It's okay to mourn who you were, or the loved one that you lost, or the life season that has gone by. Mourn, take a deep breath, and move on. It probably won't be the last time you have that feeling. Practice considering the big picture. And what I mean by this is try taking perspective. So when the printer makes all of your flyers pink, think about the real world problems. This isn't to say that we're in the suffering Olympics and we have to constantly think about somebody has it worse, so I shouldn't feel bad about the real and true struggle that I'm experiencing. You can feel your pain, you can feel the suckage, but trying to take a moment when possible to reset your perspective, look at the bigger picture, look at just things that you have to be grateful for, that can really help kind of reorient your mindset and help you intentionally cultivate that resilience by focusing on more positive aspects of life. One of the sources I'll share at the end was looking at teenagers specifically who had a upward tick in their mental health. I believe it was of a high school class. They were doing better in the mental health department specifically because they were taking time each day to reflect on at least one positive memory from the day before. So there's lots of experiences. We're not looking towards toxic positivity where nothing's bad ever, but just gratefulness in general and intentional mindfulness of the good moments can really help us. Additionally, work on developing a positive view of yourself. So we chatted about how low self-esteem can be such a bugger sometimes. Working on kind of developing a positive opinion of yourself is going to help you see that you deserve to succeed. You deserve to have friends and family around you that love and care about you. You deserve to have social communities, things that take a lot of bravery to step forward and kind of develop. If we can work on our self-esteem, that goes a long way in developing resilience. And again, this can look so different for everyone, but our ending activity will actually force you to sit down, think, and write something down so that in the moment when you are attempting to practice resilience is not also the moment that you are trying to develop an action plan. Yes, practice optimism. So along the lines of considering the bigger picture, even if you're a pessimist by nature, which I would certainly consider myself, when you're laying in bed at night and you're doing the worst picture spiral. You're going, I'm going to fail my exam, and then I'm going to fail the class, and then I'm never going to graduate, and then my family's going to hate me forever. Sure, that is a possibility. But take 30 seconds, just 30 seconds when you're doing the doom spiral to ask yourself the question, what if I get an A? What if I pass the class? What if I earn my degree? And what if my family is so proud of me? It takes the same amount of time to envision the best case scenario as it does the worst case scenario. So at the very least, try both. Practicing self-care. How do you feel relaxed? How do you feel more in touch with yourself in such a busy grind culture? Sometimes what we really need is to slow down and care for ourselves, and it is often the first thing to go. When you have a family that is dependent on you, especially children, it can be so hard to calm down and take a moment for yourself. But whenever possible, whatever it is for you, from the bath and the candle, to the long walks on the beach, to reading the book, to more social, physical activity, whatever it may be, if you can, try to pencil in something like this at least once a week. Whether it's 2 hours or 20 minutes, this can make a huge difference in resetting how you feel. And finally, look for opportunities of growth and learning. Whether you knew it or not, you all took your first step towards developing resilience by being here today. So congratulations, pat yourself on the back. Whenever we can look for those opportunities to grow our knowledge base, that can be very helpful in increasing the connectivity between the parts of the brain, because we learn from one another. Just like John and David and Shelly and our friend in the back are communicating that well, here's how I developed resilience. We can learn from that. We can think, okay, what shared experiences do I maybe have that I can call on, that I can recall, that I can learn from? The stories of other people help us. So with that, and I'll pass these out. You can either fill these out now or later, but I highly encourage you not to throw them in the recycling bin, because it is so challenging sometimes to know how to help yourself when you're in the thick of it, when you are in the trenches. So if we can develop a resilience plan that you can stick to the fridge or in some file folder in your office, but you at least know it exists later when you're really feeling the struggle, it can be very helpful. So we'll pass those out and then we'll be open to Q&A time. Take some from you, Courtney. Oh. Take about 1 more minute for this in this space, and if you don't finish, don't worry about it. You can continue to fill it out as we move through Q&A or just any time today. Okay. With about 5 or 6 minutes left, I think we're open for Q&A.
I'll jump us off a little bit. I want to thank you for presenting this and sort of coming to realize how I've processed things in the past and how I'm hoping to process them in the future. And some of the things that have really helped me are therapy. I'm a big fan, and my dog. And so, like, if things are bad, go walk my dog, and things will be a little bit better. Like, they're not going to be all the way better, but they're going to be a little bit better. And so, finding that sort of source of support, even in the form of not people, can be useful as well. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Hey, Julia, great talk. I want to add on to what Courtney said because I didn't used to be a dog person until my wife converted me, and now we have three. And dogs have changed my life. And I've had some low periods recently, and snuggling with my dogs, having them, give me kisses, and they're just so angelic and full of love that I recommend that as a transformative experience for everybody.
Step 1 of your resilience plan, get a dog.
So I had a question for you regarding this section that talks about advice you'd give to a friend.
Okay.
Obviously, I'm not going to encourage my friend to suffer some hardships. So I guess what I'm asking is what advice would you give to a friend?
I really like that question. I think that it would be very individualized based off what is my level of connection to that person. So just gonna like call people out of the room. One of our librarians here, Ian King, I would consider a very close friend, right? So I might be very direct with Ian, and I feel like I know Ian pretty well. So depending on what kind of trial he's experiencing, I'm going to tailor my language, but I'm probably gonna say something like, Ian, get the heck out of your house and let's go do something fun. Because I know that he's going to want to be around people and that would be helpful to him. So that's kind of how I would approach it, individualized based off what the experience is and how well I know the person. The other thing that I'm thinking about is, as Courtney mentioned at the very beginning, I lead an awesome team of student workers here on campus. I have about 15 right now. And I'm close to them, sort of, but they're also students and my employees. So the way that I might connect or relate with them would have some different professional workplace boundaries, right? So how can we support the kind of different styles of people in our life? So I might ask a lot of questions. That might be kind of a cheat code for advice I'd give a friend, but I guess I would just pencil in something like ask good questions, because I think oftentimes we just need somebody to hear us. When we're struggling, we just need somebody to sit with us. And friends are great, but also to Courtney's point, go to therapy. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Thank you for asking.
So on that note, advice to give a friend, excuse me. I'm Shelley for those that are watching online. I had a situation that happened where there was a major event in my life and somebody that shoulda, coulda, woulda showed up didn't. And 20 years later, I'm talking to a close friend. She was almost old enough to be my mom. And I was like, and she didn't show up. She didn't show up. She didn't show up. And then she looked at me and she asked me a question. And she said, what would have happened if she did show up? And all of a sudden I realized that that person would have controlled the event. They're a very controlling person and they would have controlled the event. So my advice would be, if you can, try to change your lens on the circumstances, because at that moment when she asked me that question, my lens changed and suddenly I was thankful that the person didn't show up at my life event, because it would have been a catastrophe. And here I had spent 20 years in the molly grubs about it and trying to get some resilience and trying to bounce back from it. And I still wasn't. But at that moment, when my lens changed on the situation, then all of a sudden I went from, how could she do this to me, to, I'm thankful she wasn't there.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. I think that speaks to kind of two different points that we discussed too. One of them is change your perspective. If possible, try to look at the bigger picture, try to find a different lens. And then the other is also the power of somebody sitting with you asking questions, right? Maybe that isn't a perspective change that you would have been able to consider yourself if someone hadn't launched the thought to you. Yeah.
Okay, one more. How about?
So some things that helped me in the past are things combined, or thinking about the big picture and reflecting on how past events affected me. Specifically, like I got in my first car accident earlier this year. I was driving back a late night from Astoria, hit a big pile of rocks in the middle of the road. It's kind of a scary event, but in the end, at the time, I wasn't worried at all, which was kind of surprising. My wife was with me, she was uninjured, and really thinking of big picture, what's the worst thing here? My car got totaled, cost me some hours of sleep, a few $100s in tow charges. no big deal. I'm lucky enough to have savings. None of this really mattered. So kind of thinking big picture, in the moment, everything was kind of bad, but none of it really mattered long term. And now it's months later, and it's just kind of a fun story to tell that, I got a different car and I'm a few $100s poorer, but what does any of that matter? Everybody was safe, and the big picture is what was really important.
I really appreciate you sharing that because I love that perspective of it's not that the car accident didn't matter. It's not that it sucks to or like doesn't suck to be in an accident and be out a car and be out a couple $100s, but just pausing to go, hey, me and my wife were completely uninjured. And I think when you hit the landslide, that's pretty critical. So that's awesome. Just taking the moment to be like, that's annoying, but the important stuff is all good to go. That's great.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to Julia for giving this wonderful talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
And please join us again next week on October 10th, Thursday here, same time, same. I have to say the joke. I'm of the age. Same bat time, same bat channel. Ashley Cahill will be here. She'll be talking about heat, hospitality, and hummus, my life in Saudi Arabia. So please join us next week. Thank you all.